She was 51 years old, and she owned nothing but a carpet bag, a winter coat with a fraying hem, and $37 folded inside a handkerchief her mother had embroidered 40 years before. The Halverson Packing Company, three brothers with ledgers sharp as knives and hearts to match, had dismissed her without severance, without reference, without so much as a parting word that carried human warmth. After 22 years of faithful labor managing their cannery books and their workers' wages along the cold Oregon coast, they had brought in a nephew from Portland who wore a celluloid collar and spoke of modern efficiency, and that was the end of Nora Clausen. She walked out of the Halverson building on a gray Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1903 and did not look back, because looking back at a thing that has swallowed your best years is a cruelty you do not have to accept. With those $37 she purchased, for $30 even, a deed to the old gantry cannery at the south end of Oysterman's Wharf in the small coastal town of Crestfall, Oregon, a building the county had been trying to unload for 11 years, a place of buckled floorboards and shattered skylights, and a great rusted boiler that squatted in the back room like a sleeping iron animal no one had touched since 1892. Everyone in Crestfall thought she had lost her mind. The harbor master laughed. The woman at the land office shook her head slowly, the way people do when they pity you too much to say so aloud. But inside that rusted boiler, sealed away from the salt air and the passing years, something waited. Something that would not only save Nora Clausen from destitution, but would give an entire overlooked community back what had been quietly stolen from them decades before. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Clausen. If you have ever stood in a place others have abandoned and felt, against all reason, that it still had something left to give, tell us about it in the comments. We have to begin, as all honest stories do, not at the moment of crisis, but at the moment of formation. The years that made a person into the particular shape they would need to be when the hard time finally arrived. Nora Clausen was born in 1852 in the Willamette Valley, the second of 4 children raised by a Dutch father who had come to Oregon with nothing but a seed catalog and an absolute faith in the principle that careful record-keeping was the nearest thing to prayer a practical person could manage. Peter Clausen kept books for 3 farms besides his own, and in the evenings, when the lamp was lit and the children sat around the table doing their lessons, he would spread his ledgers out and work through them with a deliberateness that Nora found, even as a small girl, deeply beautiful. There was something in the act of accounting that appealed to her sense of order, her quiet hunger to understand how things connected, how a poor harvest in August could be traced back to a decision made in March, how a family's security was not luck, but the accumulation of small, careful choices documented faithfully over time. She was not a romantic girl in the way that word was used then, meaning given to dreams and sentiment and the soft haze of wishful thinking. She was, instead, a girl who noticed things. She noticed the weight of a bolt of cloth before she was told its price, and she could guess within a penny. She noticed when a neighbor's fence posts were set too shallow, and she was right every time the winter storms proved her out. She noticed people, their habits and their fears, the specific way a man's voice changed when he was telling the truth about something painful versus the way it changed when he was constructing a comfortable story. Her mother, Alce, had come from a family of weavers in Zeeland, and though there was no loom in the Clausen house, Alce wove in the way she kept her household, with attention to the tensile strength of things, to which threads bore weight and which were decorative, to the fact that a fabric's beauty and its usefulness were not in competition, but were, when the work was done right, the same quality expressed twice. Alce embroidered on winter evenings, small, intricate patterns on handkerchiefs and pillowcases, and she taught Nora to do the same, not because she thought Nora would spend her life embroidering, but because she believed that any skill requiring you to hold many threads in your mind simultaneously while keeping your hands steady was a skill that would serve you in ways you could not yet predict. Nora was 12 when she finished her first complete handkerchief, a pattern of coastal flowers, wild iris and sea campion, worked in blue and cream thread, and Altje held it up to the lamp and said, in Dutch, that it was good work, which was the highest praise Altje ever gave, and which Nora remembered for the rest of her life. By the time Nora was 18, she was keeping books for 2 of the valley farms her father served, and she had developed the habit, one that would define her entire working life, of never trusting a number that arrived without a story attached to it. A figure in a ledger was not a fact, she believed. It was a compressed narrative, and if you could not reconstruct the narrative from the figure, you did not yet understand the figure. This habit made her slow, sometimes, and meticulous always, and it made certain men uncomfortable, because meticulous women with a talent for finding the story behind a number are not entirely convenient in a world where some numbers have been arranged to conceal their stories, rather than reveal them. She did not particularly care about this discomfort. She had her father's calm stubbornness, which was the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but simply does not move. She arrived in Crestfall in 1881, 29 years old, recommended for the Halverson Packing Company position by a valley merchant who had relied on her books for 6 years without a single error. The Halverson brothers, Arne, Knut, and the youngest, Berger, ran the largest salmon cannery on that stretch of the coast, and they needed someone who could manage the wages for 60 seasonal workers, negotiate the fish contracts, and keep 3 separate sets of accounts reconciled against one another. It was, by the standards of the time, extraordinary work for a woman, and Nora knew it, and she accepted it, not with gratitude exactly, but with the quiet recognition that the work itself was what she had been built for, and that the fact of her being a woman was simply one of the more irrelevant details in the arrangement. For 22 years she gave the Halverson Packing Company her mornings and her evenings, and most of the hours in between. She knew every worker by name, knew which ones sent money home to families in Astoria, and which ones were saving for land, knew the tide tables and the fish run calendars, and the cost of tin plate from San Francisco as intimately as she knew the embroidered flowers on her mother's handkerchief. She lived in a small rented room above a chandler's shop on the harbor, and she was, by the narrow definitions available to a woman in that place and time, content, which is not the same as happy, but is perhaps more durable. We should tell you, before we move forward, that Nora had no illusions about the Halverson brothers. She had kept their books long enough to know they were men whose kindness was situational, extended when it cost nothing and retracted when it became inconvenient. She was useful to them, and they were decent to her in the way that people are decent to useful things. What she had not fully anticipated was the particular flavor of the end, the way it would be arranged not as a dismissal, but as a replacement, as though the 22 years were simply a prior arrangement that had reached its natural expiration, like a lease on a storage room. The nephew's name was Henrik, and he arrived in September of 1903 with a briefcase full of printed forms from a Portland accounting firm and a conviction that the future of the canning industry lay in consolidation and standardization, 2 words he used so frequently and with such evident pleasure that Nora began to hear them in her sleep. He was not unkind to her directly, which she found, in some ways, worse than hostility would have been. He simply moved into the office beside hers and began asking, with a polite curiosity that had the texture of sandpaper, why she did things the way she did them. Why did she keep the workers' wage records in a separate ledger rather than integrating them into the main accounts? Why did she maintain a supplementary register of fish contract histories going back to 1885? Why did she cross-reference the tin supplier invoices against the actual delivery weights? These were not the questions of a man who wished to learn. They were the questions of a man building a case. Arne Halverson called her into his office on the second Tuesday of October and told her that the company was restructuring its administrative operations. He said it without meeting her eyes, which she noted. He said that her service had been exemplary, which she noted also. He did not say thank you, which she noted most of all. She walked out of the Halverson building with her carpet bag, her coat, and $37, and the embroidered handkerchief in her pocket, and the city of Crestfall spread before her in the autumn fog like a question she had not yet been given the words to answer. She spent 3 days in her rented room, working through her options with the same systematic thoroughness she had applied to every problem that had ever landed on her desk. She was 51. She had no family remaining in the valley, her parents gone, her siblings scattered to California and Montana by the ordinary migrations of a restless century. She had skills that were demonstrably valuable and demonstrably unwanted by the people with the power to hire her. She had $37. The chandler, a patient man named Ruis, had told her gently that he would need the room back by November, as his sister was coming from Astoria. It was Ruhus, in fact, who mentioned the gantry cannery. He said it with the particular offhandedness of a person who expects to be told it is a ridiculous idea, which is sometimes the way that the right ideas are introduced into the world. The county had been holding the deed since old Ephraim Gantry had died intestate in 1892, leaving no heirs anyone could locate. The building had sat empty for 11 years, accumulating salt rust and reputation as the kind of place that defeated everyone who looked at it. The county wanted $30 for it, which was less than a month's wages for a skilled craftsman, and the reason the price was so low was that no one believed the building was worth the cost of tearing it down, let alone restoring it. Nora walked the length of the wharf on a Wednesday morning and stood inside the gantry cannery for 45 minutes without speaking. The salt light came through the broken skylights in long, cold columns. The floorboards were soft in places but sound in others. The gutting tables along the north wall were still bolted in place, their surfaces scoured white by years of ocean air. And in the back room, occupying a full quarter of the floor space, stood the boiler. A Cornish-style fire tube boiler, she guessed, from the late 1870s or early 1880s, roughly 8 feet in diameter and perhaps 12 feet long, its iron skin the color of old blood, its access hatch sealed shut with what appeared to be rust and something else, something deliberately applied around the seam, a substance that had dried to the color of the surrounding iron and was therefore nearly invisible, unless you were the kind of person who looked for the stories behind the surfaces. Nora was exactly that kind of person. She bought the cannery that afternoon for $30 even, which left her $7 and the handkerchief and the coat. The woman at the land office shook her head. Nora thanked her and walked back to the gantry building with her carpet bag and her deed, and sat down on a gutting table in the salt light, and ate the last of the bread she had brought from her room, and considered what she had done. She spent the first 3 days simply cleaning, which is what a person with good sense does when they acquire a complicated thing. They remove the layers of neglect before they try to understand what is underneath. She swept the floor and replaced 3 of the worst floorboards with lumber she found stacked in the lean-to behind the building. She covered the broken skylights with oilcloth she bought on credit from Ruis, who trusted her in the way that people trust someone they have watched be careful with things for 22 years. She cataloged every piece of equipment remaining in the building: the gutting tables, a set of sealing machines of a design she did not immediately recognize, several crates of unmarked tin plate, and the boiler. It was on the 4th day that she turned her full attention to the boiler. She brought a lantern and set it on the floor beside the access hatch and crouched down to examine the seam. What she had seen from across the room was confirmed at close distance. The hatch had been sealed not merely by rust, but by a careful application of rendered tallow mixed with iron filings, worked into the seam and smoothed flat, a technique she associated not with a boilermaker's repair, but with a person who wished to make a sealed container look like an inoperative machine. The tallow had long since hardened to the consistency of old soap, and she worked at it for the better part of an hour with a short iron pry bar and a patience that she had been developing since the age of 12, when she had first learned to hold many threads in her mind, simultaneously, while keeping her hands steady. The hatch opened with a sound like a long exhale, as though the boiler had been holding its breath for 11 years. The interior was dry, the tallow seal had done its work, and the lantern light fell across a space that was, to Nora's eye, immediately and unmistakably organized. Not abandoned, organized. There were 2 oilskin-wrapped packages resting on a wooden shelf that had been fitted inside the boiler's lower chamber, with the kind of careful carpentry that speaks of someone who expected the shelf to last a long time. There was a tin box the size of a bread loaf, latched but not locked, and there was a glass jar with a waxed cork stopper, inside which was a folded letter. Nora sat on the floor of the gantry cannery with the lantern between her knees and read the letter first, because she was a person who always found the narrative before she examined the figures. The letter was written in a precise, slanted hand on paper that had kept its integrity inside the dry boiler for 11 years. It was dated June 14th, 1892, 3 weeks, Nora would later calculate, before Ephraim Gantry had died. The writer was Gantry himself, and the letter was addressed, with a simplicity that she found immediately moving, to whoever finds this, which was a form of address that assumed nothing about the future, except that the future would eventually arrive. Ephraim Gantry, the letter explained, had come to Crestfall in 1871 as a young man with a lease on the cannery building and a conviction that the salmon run on that stretch of coast was sufficient to support an independent operation separate from the larger packing companies that were already consolidating their hold on the Oregon coast. He had been right about the salmon and wrong about the consolidation. By the mid-1880s, the Halverson Packing Company, through a combination of practices that Gantry described in the letter, with a restrained bitterness that was more damning than any outright accusation, had systematically undercut his fish contracts, pressured the Chinese and native workers who formed the backbone of his seasonal crew to sign exclusive agreements with Halverson, and arranged, through a relationship with the county assessor whose nature Gantry implied without specifying, for his property taxes to be assessed at a rate that made his operation progressively untenable. By 1891, he had been forced to cease operations. He had closed the cannery, dismissed his workers, and spent the last year of his life doing what Nora recognized immediately as the work of a man with her own particular cast of mind. He had documented everything. The 2 oilskin packages contained ledgers. There were 7 of them in total, covering the years 1871 through 1891, and they were among the most meticulous records Nora had ever held. Gantry had recorded not only his own accounts, but, wherever he had been able to obtain them, the comparative figures for the Halverson operation, the contract prices offered to fishermen, the wage rates paid to workers, the assessments on comparable properties along the wharf. He had documented, in the careful, patient handwriting of a man who understood that the value of a record lies in its completeness, the precise mechanism by which a larger company had destroyed a smaller one. He had also, and this was what made Nora sit very still on the floor of the cold cannery for a long time, recorded the names and the amounts. The Halverson brothers had not merely undercut Gantry's operation. In the process of dismantling it, they had underpaid approximately 60 workers, fishermen, cannery workers, most of them Chinese immigrants and members of the local Siletz community, over a period of 5 years, systematically shorting the wage packets by small amounts that, taken individually, were easily dismissed as arithmetic errors, but that, taken together and documented against the actual contracted rates, represented a substantial sum withheld from people who had had no practical recourse. Gantry had gathered signed statements from 17 of these workers, folded carefully inside the second oilskin package. He had calculated the total amount owed. He had written to the county in 1891 and received no response. He had written to a Portland attorney and received a response that was polite and discouraging. And then he had sealed his evidence inside the boiler of his closed cannery and written a letter to whoever finds this, because he was a man who believed, as Nora believed, that a documented truth does not expire. The tin box contained money, $42 in coin and a further $60 in paper currency, which Gantry had described in the letter as the last funds of the Gantry cannery operation, set aside against the possibility that someone, someday, might be able to use them to do what he had been unable to do in his lifetime. He had written, "I do not know who will find this, or when, or under what circumstances. I know only that the workers whose names are in this ledger were owed wages they never received, and that this is a debt that does not go away simply because the men who created it would prefer it to." Nora sat in the Gantry cannery until the lantern oil ran low and the salt wind pushed through the oilcloth over the skylights and the tide came in under the wharf and lifted the building on its pilings with the slow, patient breath of the ocean. She sat with the ledgers on her lap and the letter in her hand and the tin box beside her knee, and she thought about Ephraim Gantry, who had spent his last year building an argument he did not live to make, and she thought about the 60 workers whose names were written in his careful hand, and she thought about the Halverson brothers and their nephew with his celluloid collar and his printed forms from Portland, and she thought about 22 years of her own careful work and the particular quality of Arne Halverson's averted eyes when he told her that her service had been exemplary. She rewrapped the ledgers in the oilskin and put the letter back in the jar and carried everything to the gutting table and spread it out in the order she would need to work through it. And she opened her carpet bag and took out the account book she had kept out of habit even after leaving the Halverson office, and she began to write. We should tell you that the following weeks were not easy ones. Word had spread through Crestfall, with the speed that words travel in small harbor towns, that the woman who had bought the Gantry cannery was living in it, which was true, sleeping on a cot she had borrowed from Ruis, and eating very little and working by lantern light late into the nights. The harbor master, a large, self-satisfied man named Clemens Voss, came by twice to tell her the building was a liability and the Wharf Association would be petitioning the county to have it condemned. She listened to him both times with the attentive courtesy she extended to everyone, and then went back to her work. Birger Halverson, the youngest of the brothers, the one who had always been the most openly contemptuous of her, came by once and stood in the doorway of the cannery, looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read, which was unusual, because she could generally read Birger Halverson's expressions without difficulty. He said nothing. She said nothing. He left. She understood, with the instinct that comes from 22 years of watching people navigate the vicinity of their own secrets, that someone had told the Halverson brothers she was in Gantry's building. She did not know yet whether anyone had told them why she was working so late by lantern light, but she understood that the time she had was finite and that she needed to use it well. She found, in the process of her work, that Gantry's ledgers were even more complete than she had initially assessed. He had preserved original documents alongside his own records, copies of the wage contracts, carbon copies of his correspondence with the county, a set of sworn statements from workers who had since scattered up and down the coast. She cross-referenced his figures against her own memory of the Halverson books, which was, after 22 years, essentially photographic, and she found that the pattern Gantry had documented in the 1880s had continued, in a modified, more carefully obscured form, well into the period of her own tenure. She had not seen it at the time, because she had been looking at the Halverson accounts from the inside, where the individual discrepancies were small enough to fall within the range of ordinary arithmetic variation. Seen from the outside, laid against Gantry's foundational documentation, the pattern was unmistakable. She wrote to a Portland attorney, a different one from the man Gantry had contacted 12 years before, and enclosed a carefully organized summary of what the ledgers contained, along with the original signed statements and her own supplementary analysis. She also wrote to the Oregonian, to the county seat, and to the Portland office of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which had been established 3 years prior and was, she had reason to believe, actively interested in wage theft cases involving minority workers in the coastal industries. She sent all of these letters on the same morning from the Crestfall post office, and she paid for the postage with coins from Ephraim Gantry's tin box, which seemed to her exactly the right use for them. Clemens Voss came back a third time, 4 days later, and this time he was not alone. He had brought Arne and Knut Halvorsen, who stood behind him in the Cannery doorway with the particular posture of men who have decided that a situation requires their physical presence to resolve. Arne told her that she was in possession of documents that were the private property of the Halvorsen Packing Company, and that he expected them returned immediately. Nora looked at him with the calm attention she had been practicing since childhood, and asked him to explain, specifically, how private business records from an independent cannery that had ceased operations before the Halvorsen Company acquired any interest in this building could constitute the private property of the Halvorsen Packing Company. Arne said that was a legal matter. Nora agreed that it was, and said that she had recently been in contact with several attorneys and government offices who shared her interest in resolving it through the appropriate legal channels. There was a silence. Knut Halvorsen made a sound that was not quite a word. Arne turned and walked out, and Knut followed him, and Clemens Voss lingered for a moment in the doorway looking at the floor, and then he left too. She was not, in the weeks that followed, without allies. Ruis knew, because she had told him, and he had said nothing except that he thought Gantry had been a decent man, which was his way of saying he was on her side. The woman at the land office, whose name was Petra Moen, came by one afternoon and sat on a gutting table and looked at the organized spread of Gantry's documents and said, in a careful voice, that her father had worked for Gantry in the late 1880s and had always believed he had been underpaid in his final season, but had never been able to prove it. Nora opened the ledger to the relevant page and showed her. Petra sat very still for a moment. Then she asked what she could do to help. What followed was not dramatic in the way that resolutions in stories sometimes are. No courtroom scenes, no public confrontations, no single moment of spectacular reversal. What followed was the slower and, we think, more genuinely satisfying process of careful documentation meeting its proper institutional audience. The Portland attorney wrote back within 2 weeks. The Bureau of Labor Statistics sent an investigator, a quiet young man from Eugene named Hartwell, who wore a good coat and asked precise questions and took careful notes. The county assessor's office, faced with Gantry's documented comparison of assessment rates across comparable wharf properties, opened an inquiry that would eventually establish that the Gantry cannery had been assessed at nearly double the rate of the Halvorsen property during the same period. A discrepancy for which the current assessor, not the same man, but inheritor of the same records, could offer no defensible explanation. The Halvorsen Packing Company settled in the spring of 1904 without admitting to specific wrongdoing, which is the way that powerful institutions settle things when they have been caught, but retain enough influence to negotiate the terms of their accountability. The settlement established a fund administered through the county for the documented unpaid wages of the 60 workers Gantry had named, with interest calculated from the date of the original underpayment. Many of those workers were no longer alive, their families were located where they could be, and the money was paid to them. Some could not be found, and for those, the remaining funds went to a joint account held in trust for the Chinese fishermen's community in Crestfall and for the Siletz families along the coast, to be used for purposes those communities determined themselves. The Halvorsen brothers did not lose their company. That is the honest version of the story. They paid what was determined, and they continued, somewhat chastened, in business, and Henrik, with his celluloid collar, remained in the accounting office. But Arne Halvorsen, who had dismissed Nora without meeting her eyes, found himself in the particular position of having to meet her eyes regularly in the years that followed, because Nora Klassen did not leave Crestfall. She stayed, and she rebuilt the Gantry Cannery, slowly, and with the money from the settlement's administrative fees that the county had, after Petra Moen's advocacy, awarded to the person who had brought the documentation forward. She replaced the floorboards and repaired the skylights and cleaned the rust from the great boiler and had it assessed by a mechanic from Astoria, who told her it was, beneath the surface deterioration, structurally sound, which she had suspected, because she had learned by then to look past a thing's surface to the integrity beneath. She did not reopen it as a cannery. She knew the industry, and she knew the direction it was moving, and she understood that what Crestfall needed was not another packing operation competing in a consolidating market. What she opened, in the autumn of 1904, was a cooperative, a workers' exchange where the independent fishermen and their families could process and sell their catch without the intermediary of the large companies, keeping the full contract value for themselves. She kept the books, of course, with the same meticulous thoroughness she had always brought to numbers. She hired Petra Moen to help her. She named the enterprise the Gantry Cooperative because she believed that when a person builds something to correct an injustice, the least they can do is name it after the person who first documented the injustice and trusted the future to act on it. Clemens Voss never did petition to have the building condemned. He stopped coming by altogether, which was a different kind of resolution, but an adequate one. We think about Nora Klassen sometimes when we consider the particular shape that resilience takes in quiet people, not the dramatic, declarative kind that announces itself and seeks recognition, but the kind that is really just a refusal to stop working carefully at a thing until the thing yields its truth. She had been trained for exactly this work by a father who believed that a figure in a ledger is a compressed story, and a mother who believed that holding many threads in your mind simultaneously while keeping your hands steady was a skill that would serve you in ways you could not yet predict. She had spent 22 years developing her understanding of the specific ledgers that would matter, without knowing that was what she was doing. She had arrived at the moment of her dismissal with nothing but $37 and a handkerchief and a coat, and she had taken the one option that presented itself, the rusted, salt-eaten, universally dismissed building at the south end of the wharf, and she had looked at it not with the eyes that see what something is, but with the eyes that look for the story behind the surface. The boiler had been sealed with tallow and iron filings by a dying man who trusted the future. She had been exactly the future he was trusting. We want to circle back, as we always do, to where we began. A woman of 51 years, $37, a carpet bag, and a coat with a fraying hem. A building that everyone agreed was worthless. A rusted boiler that no one had touched in 11 years. We told you at the start that what was sealed inside it would change her life and restore a community, and we hope that by now you understand that we meant both of those things precisely and without exaggeration. The workers' families who received what Ephraim Gantry had documented for them, that was the restoration, the cooperative that stood in the Gantry building through the end of that decade and into the next, keeping its books in Nora's careful hand and serving the independent fishermen of Crestfall against the tide of consolidation. That was the restoration too. And Nora herself, who had arrived with almost nothing and ended with a building, a purpose, a community that knew her name in the way that communities know the names of people who have acted on their behalf. That was the restoration most of all. The miracle, as we said from the beginning, was the quietest kind. It did not announce itself. It waited, sealed in iron, in the dark, for the right person to come along with the right eyes and the patience to work at a thing until it opened. The Halverson brothers are long gone, as all things pass. The Gantry Cooperative outlasted them. The boiler still stands in the back room of the building on Oysterman's Wharf, cleaned now of its rust, its iron skin, the warm gray of old pewter. Someone painted a small sign and mounted it above the access hatch. It reads, in plain letters, "Whatever is sealed in darkness, kept in faith, will find its day." We believe that is true. We believe Nora Clausen would agree. Friends, if this story settled into you the way we hope it did, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who has been told that the thing they are standing in is worthless. Someone who is working carefully and quietly at something the world has not yet recognized. Leave us a comment telling us what is a time you found unexpected value in something or somewhere that everyone else had written off. We read every one, and they matter to us more than we can easily say. If you are new here, we are grateful you found us, and we hope you will stay a while. There are more stories where this one came from, stories of women and men who looked past the surface of overlooked things and found, in the patient dark, something that was waiting to be known. Until next time, stay close.